The forest ranger met a wild girl in the taiga and froze when he noticed a detail he'd remembered for 15 years. The morning air in the Siberian taiga was crisp, almost biting, as Sergei, the forest ranger, pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders. The sun had barely risen above the horizon, painting streaks of pale gold and orange across the endless sea of fir and pine. The forest seemed alive in a quiet, watchful way, as if it could sense the presence of anyone who dared to enter its heart. Sergei had walked these trails for years, patrolling the vast wilderness and keeping an eye on the delicate balance between humans and nature. But no matter how many times he walked these paths, each day in the taiga felt new, full of secrets waiting to be discovered. Sergei's boots crunched softly over the frost-covered ground, and he paused for a moment to listen. The forest was almost silent, save for the distant call of a woodpecker and the whisper of the wind through the tall trees. He had learned long ago that the taiga could be peaceful one moment and deadly the next. Wolves roamed these lands, and even the smallest mistake could lead a person into serious trouble. He carried a small pack with supplies, binoculars, and a radio, just in case, though he had rarely needed it. He trusted his instincts and his years of experience. As he walked deeper into the forest, Sergei noticed something unusual. A few feet off the main trail, there were footprints in the soft soil, barely visible beneath the layer of frost. They were small, smaller than an adult's, and they seemed to have been made recently. He knelt down to inspect them more closely. The prints were careful, almost deliberate, as if whoever had made them knew the forest well. Something about them made Sergei pause. People rarely wandered this deep into the taiga without reason. Most hunters stayed near their villages, and hikers almost never ventured beyond the marked paths. Whoever had left these prints had a purpose, and that made Sergei cautious. He followed the trail slowly, careful not to disturb it. Every step was deliberate, measured, as he scanned the surroundings for signs of movement. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees standing like silent sentinels. After walking for nearly half an hour, Sergei saw it, a small fire pit, blackened stones arranged in a circle, and remnants of a tiny shelter made of branches and moss. It was simple but clearly functional. Someone had stayed here recently, though the forest had begun to reclaim it. Sergei's heart quickened. This was not just a random camper. This was someone who knew how to survive in the wilderness. He crouched low and examined the area carefully. There were traces of food, berries, small fish bones, and some dried roots. He realized that whoever lived here was not just passing through. They had been surviving alone, relying on the forest itself to provide. Sergei felt a mix of curiosity and concern. Surviving in the taiga was not easy, especially alone. Most adults would struggle. For a child, it was nearly impossible. As he stood and scanned the forest, he thought he heard something, a soft sound carried by the wind. At first, he dismissed it as the rustling of the trees, but then he realized it was a quiet singing, faint and distant, yet eerily clear. It was not like any bird or animal he knew. The melody was simple, almost childish, but with a haunting quality that made him stop in his tracks. Sergei's hand instinctively moved toward the small knife at his belt. He had encountered wild animals before, and he knew better than to underestimate any sound in the taiga. He moved slowly, stepping over roots and carefully around bushes. The singing grew slightly louder, but it was still impossible to locate exactly. Then, through a break in the trees, he caught a glimpse of movement. At first, it was just a flicker, a shadow among the trunks, but then he saw her. She was small, perhaps 12 or 13, with long tangled hair and bare feet. Her clothes were rough, made from animal hides and patched together, dirty but practical. She moved with an unusual grace, almost like she belonged to the forest itself. She carried a bow in her hand, but there was no sign of fear or hostility. Sergei froze. The girl stopped as well, and for a moment, neither moved. The forest seemed to hold its breath. There was something about her that was striking, not just her wild appearance, but the way she looked at him, with sharp, alert eyes that seemed far older than her years. She studied him carefully, as if she were trying to understand whether he was a threat or not. Sergei's mind raced. Children sometimes got lost in these forests, but this one had survived on her own for a long time, he could tell. He tried to speak gently, keeping his voice calm and even. "Hello, I'm Sergei. I'm a ranger." "Are you okay?" The girl tilted her head but did not respond. She only blinked at him, her eyes cautious yet unafraid. Sergei noticed the way she held herself, confident, capable, and completely in tune with her surroundings. She was not a normal child. She was someone who had learned the forest as her home, who trusted it more than she trusted people. Then, as Sergei's gaze moved from her eyes to her neck, he froze in shock. Hanging around her neck was a small pendant, a tiny piece of metal on a thin chain. It was simple, unadorned, but it was unmistakable. Sergei's breath caught. He had seen this pendant 15 years ago when a young girl had gone missing from a nearby village. The child's disappearance had haunted him ever since. Despite every search effort, she had never been found. The case had remained open, a cold wound in his memory that refused to heal. For a moment, Sergei could not move. Memories of that day, the frantic parents, the village in panic, the endless searches through forests just like this one, came rushing back. He remembered the pendant clearly because the missing child had worn it the day she vanished. Now seeing it around this girl's neck, he could hardly believe his eyes. Could this really be her? After 15 long years, could the child he had searched for all this time have survived alone in the forest? He tried to steady his thoughts, not wanting to scare her. He took a small step forward, keeping his hands visible. "Do you remember this?" he asked softly, pointing to the pendant. The girl's expression flickered for a moment and she looked down at it. Then, almost imperceptibly, she touched it with her fingers. There was recognition there, but it was mixed with caution. She had clearly learned to trust the forest more than anyone else. Sergei realized that earning her trust would take patience. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the faint scent of pine and the distant smoke of a campfire. Sergei knew he had to be careful. One wrong move, one sudden gesture, and the girl could disappear into the taiga in an instant, vanishing like a shadow among the trees. He remembered all the training, all the advice older rangers had given him about dealing with lost or wild children. Calmness, patience, and respect for their instincts were crucial. He knelt slightly to appear less threatening, keeping his voice low and steady. "I want to help you," he said. "You don't have to be afraid." The girl tilted her head again, studying him. There was a long silence, broken only by the distant cry of a bird. Sergei felt a strange mix of fear and hope. For 15 years, he had carried the memory of this missing child like a shadow. And now, here she was, alive, right in front of him. Slowly, he reached into his pack and took out a small piece of bread, holding it out gently. The girl's eyes flicked to it, and after a moment's hesitation, she stepped forward and took it. Her hands were small but steady, and she ate quickly, almost as if she had been hungry for a long time. Sergei watched her carefully, noting every movement, every expression. She was cautious but not aggressive. She was wild, yes, but also intelligent and resourceful. As she ate, Sergei let his mind wander, thinking about how she must have survived all these years. The taiga was unforgiving, harsh winters, dangerous animals, and vast stretches of wilderness that could swallow a person whole. And yet, here she was, alive, carrying memories of her childhood, holding onto a piece of her past, the pendant. It was a miracle, and yet Sergei knew that the hardest part was still ahead, convincing her that she could trust him, that she could return to the world she had lost. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. The forest around them seemed endless, but for the first time in 15 years, Sergei felt a glimmer of hope. He had found her. She was alive. And now, in the quiet, frozen morning of the taiga, their story was beginning again, in a place where survival had been her only teacher, and hope had been his only companion. Sergei looked at her again, trying to memorize every detail, the wildness of her hair, the sharpness of her eyes, the way she moved with careful grace. He knew that the journey ahead would be difficult, that the world outside this forest would be strange and overwhelming for her. But for now, in this moment, they simply stood there, two souls connected by a past neither had forgotten, surrounded by the silent, watchful trees of the taiga. And then, as the morning light shifted, casting long shadows across the frost-covered ground, Sergei felt it, a strange, almost magical sense of destiny. 15 years had passed, countless searches and sleepless nights. And yet here she was, alive, a living testament to survival, resilience, and the enduring bond of memory. He knew, without a doubt, that this encounter would change both of their lives forever. The girl stayed silent as Sergei watched her carefully. He could see the cautious intelligence in her eyes, the way she measured every movement he made. She didn't run. She didn't attack. She simply observed him, as if trying to decide whether he belonged in her world. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath. The taiga, vast and mysterious, was her home, and anyone entering it without respect could be met with danger. But somehow, Sergei had passed her silent test. He knelt a little lower, holding his hands where she could see them. "I won't hurt you," he said gently. "I'm just curious about you. I want to help." He didn't know if she understood everything he said, but his tone, calm and soft, seemed to reach her. She shifted slightly, but did not move away. Her fingers tightened around the small bow she carried, and he noticed the precision in her grip. She had clearly learned to use it from a very young age. Survival had made her skilled, strong, and cautious. Sergei remembered the pendant around her neck. The same small, simple piece of metal that had belonged to the child who had disappeared 15 years ago. He could hardly believe what he was seeing. Could this wild, forest-bred girl really be her? His mind raced through the years, the endless searches, the missing child posters, the parents' silent despair. The thought that she might have survived all this time, alone in the taiga, seemed impossible, and yet the pendant made it undeniable. To test her without frightening her, he slowly reached into his pack and took out a small piece of dried meat. He set it on a flat stone a few feet away and stepped back. The girl's eyes flicked to it, wary. She lowered her bow a fraction but remained still, studying him as carefully as he studied her. Hunger was clear in her eyes, but trust had to come first. Sergei stayed quiet, letting her decide. Minutes passed, the wind rustling through the trees and carrying the faint scent of pine and frost. Then cautiously, she stepped forward, grabbed the meat and backed away. She ate slowly, her eyes never leaving him. Sergei allowed himself a small sigh of relief. The first fragile connection had been made. He didn't know her name. He didn't know what she remembered of her childhood. All he knew was that she was alive, and she had survived in a way that most adults could not. She had learned the forest as her teacher, and it had shaped her into someone extraordinary. He tried speaking again, this time showing her the pendant. "Do you know what this is?" he asked softly, holding it up where she could see. Her eyes widened slightly, and for a moment her grip on the bow relaxed. Then she reached out and touched it, running her fingers over the metal. There was recognition there, subtle but undeniable. She didn't speak, but her reaction confirmed what Sergei had feared and hoped at the same time. This was the missing child. He lowered himself to sit on a fallen log, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. He wanted to learn from her, to understand how she had survived alone for so long. "You live here," he said, pointing around at the dense forest. "All by yourself." She looked at him, then at the forest, then back to him. Finally, she nodded slightly. Her eyes were wary but not hostile. She had clearly learned to survive in this wild place and had little reason to trust strangers. Sergei's mind wandered to her childhood, to the parents who had never given up hope. 15 years ago, she had vanished without a trace. No clues, no leads, nothing to explain how a young child could disappear so completely. And now here she was, not only alive but thriving in the wilderness. He thought about how much she must have endured. Winters so cold that even animals struggled to survive, the dangers of wild animals, hunger, isolation. And yet she had endured. She had survived. The girl lowered her bow completely now and sat down a few feet away from him. She was still cautious but curious. Sergei realized that this was her first real human interaction in years, and he had to approach it carefully. He began to talk slowly, telling her about simple things: the sun, the stars, the wind, and the way humans sometimes work together to survive. He didn't ask too many questions. He didn't force conversation. He simply spoke gently, allowing her to listen and decide whether to respond. After some time, she began to imitate his words, repeating them softly. Her pronunciation was rough, influenced by the sound she had picked up from the forest, and perhaps the few words she remembered from before she disappeared. Sergei smiled gently. It was a small step, but it showed that she wanted to communicate. The bond, fragile and delicate, was beginning to grow. He decided to observe how she lived, learning from her as much as she might learn from him. She showed him how she trapped small animals for food, how she gathered berries and roots, and how she identified which plants were safe to eat. She moved with efficiency and purpose, her hands and feet skilled from years of practice. Sergei felt a deep respect for her. Most adults could not survive in this forest for long, and here was a young girl who had made it her home. As the hours passed, Sergei noticed the small ways she expressed herself. She carved tiny symbols into the ground, patterns that seemed like a language only she understood. She mimicked the sounds of birds and animals to communicate or signal danger. He realized that the forest had become her entire world, shaping her behavior, her thoughts, and her survival skills. The wildness in her was not just physical, it was mental, emotional, and instinctive. Sergei reflected on his own life as a ranger. He had spent years in the forest, protecting it and guiding travelers, but he had never encountered someone like her. The skill, awareness, and resilience she displayed were beyond anything he had imagined a child could develop. And yet, she was still a child. She laughed quietly at small things, hesitated at new experiences, and watched him with cautious wonder. He knew that bringing her back to civilization would be delicate. One wrong word, one sudden gesture, and she could vanish into the forest again, disappearing like a shadow. For the first time, Sergei allowed himself to think about what it would mean to reunite her with her family. He had often imagined it in his mind over the years, but it had always seemed impossible. Now, seeing her in the flesh, he felt a surge of hope, mingled with anxiety. Would she remember them? Would she want to return? Could she adapt to a world so different from the one she had grown up in? These questions filled his thoughts, but he knew the only way to find out was to build trust first. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. Sergei suggested they find a small clearing to rest for the night. She didn't argue, only followed at a careful distance, her eyes scanning the forest as always. He realized that her life had been shaped by constant vigilance, by the need to notice every detail, every sound, every movement. It was no wonder she had survived so long. He felt a mixture of admiration and sadness. She had endured so much, yet had grown up without the love and care that every child deserved. As night approached, Sergei built a small fire while the girl watched from a safe distance. The flames flickered, casting light on her wild features. She did not speak, but she sat close enough to feel the warmth. Sergei offered her some water from his canteen. She drank cautiously, then handed it back without a word. The small gestures were significant. She was beginning to accept his presence, even if only in small steps. The stars began to appear, bright and cold above the vast forest. Sergei looked at them and thought of the parents who had waited all these years, who had never given up hope. He thought of the girl, surviving alone in the wilderness, yet still connected to the world she had left behind. He wondered if she remembered fragments of her childhood, or if the forest had replaced all human memory. He didn't know, but he knew that trust and patience would be the key to helping her reconnect with her past. Hours passed, and the girl finally moved closer to the fire, sitting quietly and watching the flames. Sergei spoke softly, telling her stories of the forest, of animals, and of the people who lived nearby. He did not ask for her story yet. He simply let her absorb his presence, let her understand that he was not a threat. The quiet companionship, simple and gentle, was the first real human contact she had experienced in years. As the night deepened, Sergei felt a strange sense of connection. He had found her, 15 years after she had disappeared. She had survived against impossible odds, learning the secrets of the forest that no human had ever fully mastered. And now, for the first time in years, she was allowing another human to enter her world. The moment was delicate, fragile, and full of potential. He realized that this encounter was just the beginning. The forest had been her teacher, her home, and her protector. And now, he had a chance to become a part of her story, to help her navigate the world she had left behind, and perhaps to finally give closure to a case that had haunted him for a decade and a half. The night grew colder, the fire crackling softly, and the girl finally relaxed enough to sit quietly, close to the warmth. Sergei watched her, his heart full of hope, wonder, and cautious excitement. He knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new discoveries, and new opportunities to learn from each other. But for now, they simply shared the quiet night in the heart of the taiga, two souls beginning a journey that had waited 15 long years to begin. The morning sun rose slowly over the taiga, casting a soft golden light on the frost-covered forest floor. Sergei awoke before the girl, listening to the subtle sounds of the forest waking around him, the gentle rustling of branches, the faint calls of birds, and the distant rush of a stream. He felt a mixture of hope and nervousness. Last night had been a small step, fragile, careful, but meaningful. He had offered her warmth, food, and companionship without forcing her, and she had responded. Today, he hoped, he could learn more. When he opened his eyes fully, he saw her sitting a few feet away, eyes wide and alert as always. She was examining a patch of moss with careful interest, touching it lightly with her fingers. She had not moved closer to him yet, but the distance between them had shrunk slightly. Sergei smiled softly. Trust took time, and patience was his ally. He quietly gathered some dry wood from the surrounding forest and rekindled the small fire. The smoke curled into the morning air, and the warmth of it seemed to reach her, though she did not yet come closer. Sergei decided to start slowly, showing her small things about the world beyond the forest. He took out a small notebook from his pack, worn and filled with sketches and notes about plants and animals. He pointed to a drawing of a bird and said its name softly. She tilted her head, watching him closely. Then she pointed to the bird outside and tried to mimic the sound it made. Her voice was rough but surprisingly accurate, showing that she had learned to listen carefully. Sergei nodded with encouragement, smiling at the small breakthrough. It was not conversation yet, but it was communication, and that was progress. After a while, he offered her some food again, dried fish and berries he had collected for emergencies. She hesitated but finally took it, eating slowly. He watched her hands, noting the calluses and scratches. She had clearly hunted, foraged, and survived on her own for years. Sergei could hardly imagine the challenges she had faced, the cold winters, the hunger, the loneliness. Yet she was strong, intelligent, and alert. Most importantly, she had survived. As they moved through the forest together, Sergei tried to learn more about her. He did not ask direct questions. He knew that might scare her. Instead, he used small gestures and simple words, pointing at things and naming them, showing her how humans interacted with the world. Sometimes, he would mimic her movements, crouching low or moving silently, showing her that he respected the forest as her home. Slowly, she began to mirror some of his gestures, curious but cautious. Hours passed as they explored a small clearing near a stream. The girl demonstrated how she had caught fish with her bare hands, how she set small traps for animals, and how she could tell which plants were safe to eat. Sergei was amazed by her skill and resourcefulness. She had learned everything from the forest itself, from observing and surviving. Her movements were precise, confident, and efficient. The forest had shaped her into a capable young survivor, unlike any child he had ever known. During a brief rest, Sergei noticed her studying a pattern of stones on the ground. They were arranged carefully, forming a small symbol he did not recognize. He watched quietly, realizing that these were not random. They were part of the girl's way of marking territory, tracking her activities, or perhaps even communicating with herself in the only way she knew. He felt a pang of sadness. 15 years of isolation had forced her to create her own world, a world she could control because humans had abandoned her. As the afternoon light shifted, Sergei finally decided to try a more direct approach. He knelt and showed her the pendant around her neck again. "Do you remember this?" he asked softly. She looked down at it, fingers brushing lightly over the metal. Then slowly she looked up at him with a strange mix of recognition, hesitation, and something he could not name. Memories were clearly stirring, though fragmented and confusing. Sergei realized that she might not remember everything from her early childhood, but she had retained something deep and meaningful, enough to know that this was important. He decided to introduce small signs of the world she had left behind. He drew a simple house in the dirt, showing her where humans lived and how they built shelters. She watched carefully, her fingers tracing the lines he made. Sergei smiled softly. This was the first time she had interacted with representations of the human world since she had left it. He could see curiosity sparking in her eyes, mingled with caution. She wanted to understand, but she was wary of leaving the safety of the forest. Sergei realized that he could not rush her. Trust, once broken or never fully formed, took time to rebuild. She had survived by relying on the forest and herself, so any sudden attempt to bring her into civilization could terrify her. He needed to earn her trust fully, step by step. He decided to stay with her for a few more days in the forest, showing her that he was not a threat, that he respected her skills, and that he could help her without taking away her freedom. Over the next few hours, small breakthroughs occurred. She began to respond to his simple gestures, imitating some of his movements and occasionally speaking a word or two. Her vocabulary was limited, influenced by the sounds she had learned from nature and the few words she remembered from her early childhood. But Sergei found that these small efforts were enough to build a bridge between them. Communication, even in its simplest form, was the first step toward understanding. Sergei also began to notice the small signs of her ingenuity. She had created simple tools from sticks and stones, set traps that required patience and precision, and even made rudimentary containers from bark and leaves. She moved silently, almost invisibly, and her senses were finely tuned to the environment. He could see that every sound, every shadow, every rustle of the wind was processed in her mind with extraordinary care. She was not just surviving, she was thriving, in a way that few humans could. As the sun began to lower in the sky, Sergei led her to a small clearing near a stream. The girl moved cautiously, but did not resist. He knelt by the water, showing her how to drink safely and pointing out the small fish beneath the surface. She watched closely, absorbing every detail. For a moment, Sergei imagined her as a normal child, playing near a stream, laughing and carefree. But he knew the reality of her life was far different. She had grown up in the wild, learning harsh lessons that most children never face. The forest around them was alive with subtle sounds: the whisper of the wind, the distant howl of wolves, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Sergei felt a deep respect for her resilience. She had survived all of this alone for years. He wondered what she thought of humans. Did she remember kindness, or only fear and loss? Did she even want to return to the world she had left behind? These questions remained unanswered, but he knew that the answers would come in time. As evening approached, Sergei prepared a small fire for warmth. The girl watched from a short distance, sitting quietly but attentive. He offered her some berries and a small piece of dried meat again. This time, she ate without hesitation. The small gestures, repeated over time, were slowly building a fragile trust between them. Sergei realized that this trust would be the foundation for helping her reconnect with the world she had lost. After the meal, he sat quietly, speaking softly about the forest, the animals, and the stars that would appear soon. She listened intently, occasionally asking questions through gestures or mimicking words. Sergei smiled at her progress. It was small, incremental, but meaningful. She was beginning to accept him, to consider him not as a stranger, but as someone who could be a guide, a protector, and perhaps even a friend. As darkness fell, the forest took on a mysterious, almost magical quality. Shadows stretched across the ground, and the firelight flickered against the trees. Sergei watched the girl closely, noting how she seemed to blend into the forest yet remained aware of him at all times. She was still wary, still independent, but the first seeds of trust had been planted. He knew the journey ahead would be challenging, filled with obstacles, fears, and moments of hesitation. But he also knew that this was the beginning of a new chapter for both of them, a chapter in which the past and present could meet, and in which healing and discovery were possible. Finally, as the night deepened, the girl moved slightly closer to the fire, sitting quietly and watching the flames. Sergei felt a sense of quiet triumph. It had taken patience, careful observation, and gentle persistence, but he had begun to bridge the gap between her wild world and the human world. For the first time, he saw a glimmer of connection, a hint that she might allow him to guide her, slowly and carefully, back to the life she had lost. In the silence of the taiga, surrounded by trees that had stood for centuries, Sergei and the girl shared a moment of understanding. She had survived against incredible odds, and he had found her after 15 long years. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, it felt possible that they could navigate it together. The morning light barely filtered through the dense canopy of the taiga as Sergei prepared to continue his careful journey with the girl. Last night had been a breakthrough. Small gestures of trust, shared food, and quiet companionship had begun to build a fragile connection. But today, Sergei knew, would be more challenging. He could sense her growing curiosity about him, but he could also feel the walls she had built around herself. The forest had been her home, her protector, and her teacher for years. Leaving it, even partially, would not be easy. He waited for her to rise from her small resting spot near the fire. She did so cautiously, her sharp eyes scanning the surrounding trees. Her movements were precise and deliberate, every step placed carefully. She glanced at Sergei briefly, almost as if checking whether he was ready, then continued walking alongside him without a word. The silence between them was comfortable, not strained. Sergei understood that she communicated best through observation and action, not words, at least for now. They followed a narrow path through the forest, moving carefully around frost-covered roots and under low-hanging branches. The girl's survival instincts were evident in every step she took. She would pause to examine tracks in the soil, sniff the wind, or listen intently to the distant rustle of animals. Sergei marveled at her skill, realizing she had developed senses far sharper than most adults living in the outside world. He matched her pace, careful not to startle her, knowing that the slightest wrong move could undo all the progress they had made. After a while, they arrived at a shallow stream. Sergei knelt to refill his canteen and gestured for her to drink as well. She approached slowly, cautious but willing, and dipped her hands into the clear water. For a few minutes, they drank in silence, the only sound the gentle gurgle of the stream over rocks. Sergei used the opportunity to observe her more closely. She had grown lean and strong, her body shaped by years of climbing, running, and hunting. But there was also a softness in her, the small traces of childhood that had survived despite the harshness of her life. As they rested, Sergei decided it was time to learn more about her story. He didn't ask direct questions. He had learned that this could scare her. Instead, he pointed to the pendant around her neck and then to the surrounding forest, letting her understand that he wanted to know about her life here. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. She began to gesture, pointing to different parts of the forest, mimicking hunting, gathering, and hiding. Sergei watched closely, piecing together the fragments of her survival story. She had truly lived alone for years, relying on her intelligence, instincts, and courage. The afternoon brought more challenges. Sergei noticed signs of a recent storm, broken branches, small landslides, and a few areas where the snow had turned to slippery ice. He knew that the journey back to civilization, even the small steps toward it, would not be simple. The forest was unpredictable, and the girl was used to relying on her own skills. He had to ensure that she understood he was not trying to take control, only to guide her safely. At one point, a rustling sound came from a nearby bush. The girl immediately froze, crouched low, and readied her bow. Sergei held up his hands, remaining calm. A small fox emerged, its fur reddish and thick, eyes curious. The girl lowered her bow slightly, studying the animal, then relaxed. Sergei smiled quietly. This was a perfect teaching moment. Patience, calm, and observation were as important in human interaction as they were in hunting or survival. She began to watch him with a new kind of curiosity, noticing how he moved and reacted in the forest. Hours passed, and Sergei realized it was time to address the next step, the idea of leaving the forest. He knelt and drew a simple line in the dirt, showing the forest on one side and a small drawing of houses and people on the other. Her eyes widened slightly, and she traced the line with her finger. Sergei pointed to himself and then to the drawing of the people, trying to show her that he could guide her safely to them. She hesitated, a clear sign of her inner conflict. The forest had been her protector for years. Leaving it, even with someone she trusted, was frightening. To encourage her, Sergei began telling small stories about the people she had lost, her family. He did not use names yet, knowing that too much detail could be overwhelming. Instead, he spoke gently about children and parents, about families who waited and hoped, about the kindness of humans who cared for one another. The girl listened quietly, her eyes reflecting both curiosity and hesitation. Sergei could see that her memory of humans was faint, shadowed by the forest, but not gone entirely. As the sun began to lower in the sky, Sergei suggested they find a sheltered spot for the night. She followed without argument, moving carefully but allowing him to lead. They found a small overhang formed by fallen branches and thick foliage. Sergei prepared a modest fire while she watched from a short distance. He offered her food again, which she took this time with minimal hesitation. Eating together in this small shared space was a crucial step. It symbolized a fragile acceptance of companionship and a willingness to let another human into her life. Night fell quickly in the taiga, the cold settling over the forest like a heavy blanket. Sergei and the girl sat near the fire, the flames flickering and casting dancing shadows across the trees. He spoke softly, recounting the day's events, pointing out constellations in the night sky and describing the subtle sounds of the forest. The girl listened intently, occasionally repeating his words or mimicking his gestures. It was a slow, careful communication, but it was meaningful. Trust was growing, however fragilely, between them. Suddenly, a memory seemed to surface for the girl. She drew a small symbol in the dirt, one that Sergei recognized from years ago. It was something the missing child had once drawn in her home, a mark of familiarity, comfort, and memory. Sergei's heart raced. This confirmed what he had suspected. She was indeed the child who had vanished 15 years ago. The realization filled him with awe, relief, and a renewed sense of responsibility. He had found her, but the journey of reintegration was just beginning. The girl's eyes met his, and for the first time she did not look wary. There was recognition there, a faint spark of trust and understanding. Sergei felt a surge of hope. He knew that tomorrow they would continue moving toward the edge of the forest, but for now, the simple connection they shared was enough. He could see that she was slowly beginning to understand that he was not a threat, and that leaving the forest, at least temporarily, could be safe. Before sleeping, Sergei quietly reflected on the day. He had learned more about her survival skills, her instincts, and her remarkable resilience. He had seen the first signs of memory returning, the flicker of curiosity about humans, and the growing trust in him. The path ahead would be difficult, filled with fears, challenges, and resistance, but he was ready to meet it with patience and care. As the fire crackled and the stars shone above the taiga, Sergei realized something profound. The forest had been her teacher, protector, and companion for 15 years. But now, slowly, he was becoming part of her story, a bridge to the life she had lost, a guide to a world beyond the trees. It was a delicate, fragile bond, but one that held the potential for healing, connection, and reunion. The night passed quietly, the forest full of soft, subtle sounds. Sergei felt a deep sense of responsibility. He had found her, but he had to respect her pace, her fears, and her independence. Trust had to grow naturally, step by step. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new breakthroughs. For now, they simply sat together near the fire, two souls connected by past memories and present courage, facing the unknown together in the heart of the taiga. The first light of dawn filtered through the tall, frost-covered trees of the taiga. Sergei had spent the night watching over the girl, ensuring she felt safe and warm near the small fire. The night had been quiet, yet full of subtle tension. Every crackle of the fire, every rustle of the trees, reminded him of the dangers they still faced in the forest. But this morning, there was a sense of purpose in the air. Today, he would take the next step, leading her toward the edge of the forest, toward the world she had left 15 years ago. The girl stirred as the sun rose higher. She looked tired, yet her sharp eyes immediately took in the surroundings as always. Sergei offered her some food, dried meat and berries, which she accepted without hesitation. He noticed the small changes in her behavior, a hint of trust in her movements, a willingness to follow his lead, and subtle gestures that showed she understood he meant no harm. Slowly, carefully, they set off, navigating the forest path with the same quiet care that had marked every day since their meeting. As they moved, Sergei spoke softly, explaining what lay ahead. "The trees will end soon," he said. "There are houses, people, and families waiting. You don't have to be afraid, I'll be with you." The girl glanced up at him, then at the forest stretching endlessly around them. Her hesitation was clear. The forest had been her home, her protector, and her teacher. Leaving it, even for a moment, required courage she had not needed before. Step by step, they approached the forest's edge. Sergei noticed how alert she remained, scanning the trees, listening intently and pausing frequently. He didn't rush her. Trust, he knew, had to be earned every second. After years of isolation, the transition to a world filled with humans and unfamiliar sounds could be terrifying. He allowed her to move at her own pace, guiding her gently but never forcing her forward. Finally, the dense trees began to thin, and light spilled across a small meadow. Sergei's heart raced as he caught sight of buildings in the distance, the first signs of civilization. He gestured for the girl to stop and crouched down to her level. "See that," he said softly. "People live there. There are families, children, people who care. They have been waiting for you." She stared at the buildings, her small body tense with uncertainty. Sergei could see the mixture of fear, curiosity, and instinctive caution in her eyes. He stayed close, letting her decide when to take the next step. Slowly, cautiously, she began to move forward, her small feet carrying her across the meadow. Sergei followed, matching her pace, keeping his voice calm and soothing. As they approached the edge of the village, a few curious eyes looked toward them. Sergei raised a hand in greeting, ensuring the girl saw no immediate threat. She hesitated, then followed his lead. At last, they reached a small clearing near the first buildings. Sergei paused, giving her a moment to absorb the new sights, smells, and sounds. The hum of human activity was overwhelming after years of silence in the forest, yet she stood firm, her eyes wide but steady. Sergei gently took her hand, a reassuring gesture, and led her toward a modest house at the center of the village. He had called ahead, ensuring her family was ready for this moment, and now the reunion would begin. Inside the house, her parents waited, older now, with faces lined by years of worry and hope. When they saw her, tears filled their eyes. The mother gasped, the father stepped forward, hands shaking. Sergei gave a small nod, letting them approach slowly. The girl froze for a moment, unsure, her instincts telling her to flee, yet something in their eyes, the recognition, the love, held her in place. Finally, the mother reached out. "My child, is it really you?" she whispered, voice trembling. The girl's eyes met her mother's, then the father's, and for the first time she allowed herself to step forward. She touched her mother's hand, then her father's, slowly, carefully. Tears streamed down the parents' faces as they held her, as if 15 years of fear, uncertainty, and sorrow were being washed away in a single moment. Sergei stood nearby, watching quietly, his heart full of relief and wonder. The girl looked around, taking in the room, the familiar objects, and the warmth of human contact. She had grown up in the forest, learning to survive on her own, yet this new world filled with love, family, and care was beginning to feel real. Sergei noticed her hesitation, the way she still clung slightly to him. He knelt down beside her and whispered, "It's okay. You are safe now." She looked at him, a faint smile forming, a sign of the trust that had grown between them over weeks in the forest. The family spent the day reacquainting themselves. Sergei stayed nearby, giving the girl space while offering quiet support. She asked questions, pointing to objects, mimicking words, and learning again how humans communicated. Her parents answered gently, showing patience and love, careful not to overwhelm her. Sergei felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had not only found her but had helped guide her back to the life she had been missing for so long. In the evening, after the initial excitement had settled, the girl and Sergei stepped outside. The forest stretched behind them, silent and vast. She looked back at the trees, her eyes reflecting the bond she had formed with the wild, the lessons she had learned, and the memories she carried. Sergei understood her need for balance. The forest had shaped her into who she was, and he would respect that. He knelt beside her, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "The forest will always be a part of you," he said softly. "But now you have people who love you too." She nodded, a quiet understanding passing between them. Over the next days, Sergei helped the girl adjust gradually. They walked through the village, visited the marketplace, and interacted with neighbors, all at her pace. She was cautious, curious, and learning quickly. Sergei encouraged her to explore small aspects of the human world while respecting her comfort zone. She laughed quietly at small things, tried new foods, and began to understand the rhythms of daily life. Slowly, the child who had lived alone for 15 years was beginning to reconnect with her family and the world she had left behind. Her parents were patient, allowing her to discover and learn without pressure. They marveled at her resilience, her skill, and the quiet strength she carried from her years in the taiga. Sergei remained a steady presence, guiding her through moments of fear and uncertainty, helping her bridge the gap between her past and present. The village accepted her slowly, curious and cautious, yet respecting the girl's wild spirit. One evening, Sergei and the girl returned to the edge of the forest. The air was cool and the trees stretched tall and silent. She walked to the tree line, touching the bark with reverence. Sergei watched quietly. She turned and looked at him, eyes full of gratitude and recognition. "I will come back," she whispered softly, her voice steady. He nodded, understanding the unspoken bond they had formed. The forest would always be part of her life, just as he would always be part of her journey. The reunion with her family brought closure and healing. 15 years of unanswered questions, fear and longing were replaced with love, understanding and new beginnings. The girl had survived unimaginable challenges, yet she had not lost her humanity, her curiosity, or her spirit. Sergei had helped her navigate the delicate path from isolation to reconnection, building trust, respect, and compassion along the way. In the quiet moments, Sergei reflected on his own journey. 15 years of searching, hope, and unresolved questions had finally reached a conclusion. He had not only found the missing child, but had helped her reclaim a life she had lost. The experience reminded him of the fragility and resilience of the human spirit, the power of patience, and the importance of empathy. He knew that the bond formed in the forest between guardian, guide, and survivor would remain unbroken forever. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, the girl sat with her parents, laughter slowly replacing tears, curiosity replacing fear. Sergei stood quietly, watching from a distance, feeling the weight of the journey and the joy of its resolution. The forest behind them, vast and silent, had given her life and shaped her character, but the world ahead offered love, family, and new beginnings. Finally, as night fell over the village and the first stars appeared in the sky, the girl lay down beside her parents, exhausted but safe. Sergei walked to the edge of the forest one last time, feeling the cool wind and the silence of the trees. He knew he had fulfilled a promise he did not fully realize he had made 15 years ago. The child, now a survivor and a daughter once lost, was home. The journey had ended, but the bond they shared, built from trust, patience, and courage, would never fade.